This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here, so we're the retired centurions, one of whom was in Judea the 10 years before the Jewish revolt and has much to tell us, but he's a happy fellow and we're not going to tell us tonight. I have some reflections from him. We're going to turn to a much more fun topic, which is Germanicus has taken the time to assemble a list of what you'd have to say how empires go wrong. 7 warning signs of what Germanicus calls self-harm. That's very generous. Self-destruction would be closer. That America, of course, entertains all the time. Oh, what's an example? Well, the emperor's decided that Nigeria needs his attention. You go, what? Okay, we know what Nigeria is. It's a large country, largest in Africa, ruled by a complete non-entity named Tinubu, who was elected, but he's an aged man, and his job is to protect the money that flows into Paris in the accounts of the rest of the leadership in Abuja. And the money is from the light sweet crude because they're blessed with the best oil on the planet. The rest of the country goes to the devil. North, the South, the internecine rivalry. And the emperor decides all of a sudden somebody whispers in his ear, they're killing Christians. No kidding. They've been doing that for generations. Sheep herders and goats herders called Fulani are Muslims, and they regard it as sport and necessary in their religion. Every once in a while, wipe out a church in the Christian parts of the country. Okay. I've reported on it over the years. But here we go again. The president says, stop it. Now he's right. That's what must be. Let's put it this way. In Nigeria, they're going, well, we've got to deny this, but he is right. You ask yourself, why doesn't Nigeria stop it? Because it's not really a country. It's a oil revenue is what it is. It has rebellions routinely, and it has a very sophisticated frontier of jihadists in the north that buffer it from the jihadists who are all in the West African countries of Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, all of whom are going Islamic Republic. Far away and has nothing to do with America today. Nothing. I go through all these steps to make sure that you understand this is live, that we're going to go on this adventure with no purpose whatsoever. Ask yourself, what is America's interest here? None whatsoever. Same for Venezuela. There's no interest here. The president's going to make the case that it's about defending America from drugs, but if that was true, bomb Mexico or bomb Detroit, make it safe from drugs. These are the things that empires do to entertain themselves. It's not un-Roman to entertain yourself with a rebellion somewhere. I mentioned that we all know about the Jewish revolt in 66 AD, and the Romans came in and destroyed the city by 70, wiped it out, murdered everybody. The reason we have Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism is because they escaped the city before the final destruction. When Rome destroyed a city, it was gone. Gone. There were no Jews left in Jerusalem after the massacre, but they came back eventually over centuries as a demonstration of faithfulness. However, I mentioned that the Rome had done that before. It wasn't the only time Rome did that. Around 4 BCE, 5 BCE, about the time of the birth of Jesus, there was a revolt in the north of Judea. It was called Judea at that time. It was renamed Palestine because when the Romans wiped it out, they said, we're going to rename you. We're not going to give you Judea back. So they said, let's name it for the Philistines. That's in their storytelling of people who are ignorant. So they named it Palestine for the Philistines. But when it was Judea, they came south with 3 legions from Syria, 3, and wiped out a town named Cephanus. What? What am I talking about? Cephanus. It was the capital of Galilee. You've never heard of it. They wiped it out. They're doing archival work now, trying to recover it. You can see the mosaic floors. Look at your Bible. You see Nazareth? Well, it was 4 miles north of Nazareth. It was the capital, and they wiped it out. That's who the Romans are. That's how they took care of their self-interest. Whereas our emperor, Mr. Trump, seems to be willy-nilly. Now and again, somebody whispers in his ear, Nigeria is allowing Christians to be murdered by Muslims, and he decides that we're going to go make it an adventure. Well, that's my example of self-harm, which is not paying close attention to what interest is it of the American people? What's in it for us? A very good question. That's my list, but Germanicus has a much more articulate list. So we're going to turn to a Germanicus. A very good evening to you. We'll go through it as routinely as you do. Your first recommendation to America. We do this all the time, Germanicus. You made up a list of our history. What is your first recommendation? Good evening to you.
Good evening, guys. These warnings, or what I call warning signs, I've tried to distill into maxims, little, much less than a parable, but something that you should pay attention to at all times and keep foremost in your mind when you are engaging in the practice of strategy and war. And having spent the entirety of the 25 years since 9/11 teaching a strategy in war and advising people who call themselves war fighters, one can look across the length and breadth of the war fighter world in the United States, and you can see how these maxims were and have been in those 25 years since 9/11 routinely broken, transgressed, thrown away, ignored, denied. And the first of these warnings is simple. I think they're all ultimately simple. And that is never let someone else, i.e. a foreign power, quote unquote, never let someone else define your interests and objectives and then tell you how urgent must be their achievement. And we've suffered for that. Our narrative, our sacred narrative, covers up the downside of letting some foreign power step in and entangle you, to use the word of George Washington from the farewell address. So we can look past the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek, ensnared the Republican side of U.S. politics, and that had a profound effect on our relationship with China all the way until Nixon went to Beijing. The British ensnared the United States in 2 world wars and did it very adroitly, and they did it mostly through propaganda, but also through what you might call personal squeeze in the form of Winston Churchill. And today we have a foreign power, actually several, who do their best to manipulate us. Ukraine is one. The various NATO countries and Britain, of course, still trying to leverage us when it comes to Ukraine policy, but also more visibly, I think, Saudi Arabia, to some extent Qatar, and of course Israel. And we have allowed the U.S. to be shaped into courses of action which have proven disastrous and in which we have no inherent national interest. And unfortunately, we're still in that mode to some extent. And that can be devastating. It has been devastating, and it's devastating right now.
A good lesson. Never get entangled in somebody else's failure.
And let them manipulate you. Yeah.
I was thinking of Saigon.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, that was more of a submissive client state that got out of hand.
Oh, Lord. The second lesson, never let initial success fool you into thinking you're winning. So, again, we do it all the time, Germanicus. You've come up with the centurions are laughing as you give these suggestions, of course, because they've been through this so many times.
Oh, yeah.
You win the battle the first day, you think you've won.
Well, others have fallen prey to that. I mean, the most obvious example is the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. And they were, in their own words, infected with what they called a victory disease. But I
Yes.
mean, that's part of that is understandable because the Japanese went into war with the U.S. in the most pessimistic and state of mind imaginable. None of them believed any good would come of this. So, sure, after this great victory, they let it go to their heads.
Did they give us the virus? Is that where it came from, Germanicus?
Well, we've suffered from this all the way up and down. I mean, George Washington, after the Battle of what we call Bunker Hill, which was such a tremendous, brutal beatdown of Britain, Washington thought, well, I mean, let them come and land in New York because we'll do the same thing we did in Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill. And of course, it didn't work out that way. And there's one disaster after another. There's our invasion of Canada in 1812. There's the belief that Lincoln and his circle had that, oh, and we've got our volunteers, we're just going to march and put down this rebellion. And, you know, all of the elite, the yuppies of 1861 came out in their carriages to have picnics and watch this glorious event, which turned out poorly, shall we say. And, you know, the modern retelling of this is equally profound in that there's no possible way for us to learn the lesson. The Iraq War, the invasion of Iraq, was such an example of that, where we just walked over what was essentially a moribund military, ill-equipped, dispirited, not well trained, no high-end systems, no, you know, none of the integration, synthesis of information required to fight modern war. And we thought it was a glorious victory. And it meant we'd achieved everything. Now Iraq would become a democracy. It'd become a U.S. ally, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what happened? Afghanistan was worse because there at least we won, and we won in a creative way. And then we just let it go for like 18 months while we turned our attention to Iraq. It's very hard because every single engagement since 2001 has been like that. And it has, I think, culminated in the war in Ukraine, which we put together and which we pushed. And the U.S. elites were so cock in the hoop, so over the moon about the initial success that the Ukrainian military had, and then followed up with these small, extremely costly counteroffensives, as they were called, you know, in Kherson and elsewhere. And it's mind-boggling how we kept on not just assuming that Ukraine would win handily, but when it didn't win handily, we would continue to keep harping on the initial victory that had been, after a year or so of war, been proven to be not the bellwether for the future.
Number three, Germanicus, you're beating a dead Afghan horse here.
Pony.
Hey, stay the course. That's another way of saying we lose. We do it every time. We're doing it right now.
Well, something came to me years ago, and I mean years ago, about Vietnam. And what hit me was that, well, Nixon promised to end the war, but he couldn't do that. He had to stay in and find peace with honor. And the truth of the matter is, if he'd just gotten out and said, hey, this is a Democrat war, LBJ made this war, and we're getting out, it would have been clean. It would have been clean. No one would have blamed him.
Germanicus, let's for the kids.
Yes.
LBJ made the war up.
Yeah.
Made up to get elected in 1964.
Whole cloth. Well, let's not go down the rabbit hole. But the key element here is, again, is simple. the sooner you get out, the sooner things get better. And as I put it, the failure you are forced to accept later, that's forced upon you, is always going to be worse than the failure that you choose now. It's your choice, you're in control. And this is, it can't sink in. Americans simply can't sink in. And they're not Americans, by the way, they're the courtiers in the imperial city. They're the ones who are worried about their reputation, as you put it with LBJ, their hold on political power. And they really don't care. They believe that somehow if we just stick it out, it will get better. I can't tell you how many commentators and experts like Robert Kaplan, for example, would tell me, and that was the sort of messaging of the 2003-4 period was, oh, we'll muddle through, whatever the hell that really means. I mean, we did muddle through. We got out and with our tail between our legs.
Number 4, don't let yourself have your biases confirmed by the enemy. Well, my reading of that is 1942. The assumption was that the Japanese can't fly those airplanes the way we can.
But they had poor eyesight, genetically poor eyesight. Right.
And so Pearl Harbor was a freak. It won't happen again. My God, they actually thought that. They actually committed themselves to strategy thinking the Japanese would break.
Well, you have to understand, because this was my first book and PhD thesis, is that the Navy had been preparing for war with Japan, a war that was essentially
plan orders, 1917.
They would gather together the battle fleet, and those 12 battle wagons would steam across the entire Pacific in one bound, and then they would defeat the Japanese fleet in a glorious battle.
If you had been there and challenged them, they would have asked you to leave the room.
That happened to me with my war college colleagues for real. And it happened over Afghanistan. I said in 2011, and to all my colleagues, 60 or 70 of them, I said, this war is a loser. There's no reason to continue it. And of course, they got upset. Very, 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 very upset. And the issue here is that they call it confirmation bias, but your biases are really ultimately your deepest desires. And people don't want to admit to their deepest desires, and they certainly don't want to admit that those desires are the instrument that controls their rational thought. Hence, any analysis is going to push to satisfy your desires at any cost. And of course, the cost is often defeat.
All right, we've had 4. We'll do the next 3 in just a moment. I want to recap for people who are taking notes. All right, never let a foreign power define your goals. Hence Zelensky. Never let Zelensky define your goals, or Mark Rutte of Brussels define your goals, or Keir Starmer of London define your goals. I could go on. Never let them define your goals. Well, of course, we're letting them define our goals. Number 2, your initial success is not a success. Okay? You're going to lose if you think it is. Guaranteed. We're headed out to Virginia to have this showdown with the Rebs. We'll run over them the first day, and they'll be fleeing back, and we'll walk into Richmond. Bang. Okay, number 3. If anybody says stay the course in the room, smile and quit, because it's over. The centurions are all nodding. Okay. And number 4, your judgment of the enemy should not be confirmed by your bias about the enemy. The Japanese can't fly airplanes. What happened at Pearl Harbor was a freak. We were not ready to defend ourselves. When we come back, more of Germanicus's recommendation to no one in Washington because they'll never listen, ever. That's why this is fun. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. Yes, it's a cool autumn evening. The Thames is turbulent. We're going to go to the theater later and see more Seneca because he apparently hit a strain around here. I had no idea everybody's aware for bloodletting at the emperor's level, but they are. Maybe it's because Domitian is wearing down our patience. He's obsessed. He's a Flavian, but he's the weakest of the three Flavians. And the food is good. There's still the swan meat's all gone. It was just a week at the end. But we're entertaining ourselves with our centurions. And maybe we'll have time for a story about the Jewish revolt to remind everybody what an empire does when it wants to win. It wipes out the enemy, wipes them out, doesn't rebuild them, wipes them out. No matter how they rationalize it afterwards, they're done. That's how Rome won. And when the United States comes back to that, they'll realize that the success of the 20th century was that there was not a standing building in Berlin in July of 45, not one. It was bricks. That's Rome. That was America when it was Rome. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here with Germanicus's lists of what not to do. Well, of course, the United States is following exactly this as if it's a program. Let's do what we're not supposed to do. Number 5, never think it will never happen to us. Oh, my goodness. All right, Germanicus, please explain.
In Afghanistan, we scoffed at the idea that it was, quote unquote, in lore, the graveyard of empires. And the British had fought 3 wars there, none of them satisfying. The first Afghan war in the early 1840s, they lost their entire army and all of the camp followers, all of the diplomats, everyone, boom. And we said, well, we're not Britain, We're above all of that. And as a result of our American exceptionalism, that we do things differently because we're superior, because democracy makes us smarter, better.
And the coalition dodge, Germanicus. I rushed to mention how we assembled a coalition and everybody would show up and give money.
Yeah. Well, the thing about the key here, of course, is that we were beaten as badly as any British army in Afghanistan. We ran out of the place in a shameful cavalcade of retreat. And whereas we made fun of the Russians, the Soviets, when they left Afghanistan because they had to cross a bridge. And, oh, look, they were defeated by our little Stinger missiles. The truth of the matter is, they walked out with dignity, and the regime they left behind lasted for another 3 years. So ours was a shameful withdrawal.
I mentioned in detail, Germanicus, and one of the men we empowered to defeat the Soviets was a guy named Bin Laden.
Yes.
We created our own nemesis.
And it'll never happen to me is something that an effective, victorious enterprise is hugely susceptible to, not just the United States. And this was a tremendous problem for the United States after World War II, which it did not realize. And that was that we thought of ourselves as the gods of war, and then we could not imagine, with the technology superiority we had, not so much in Korea yet, but certainly in Vietnam, we had this magical air cavalry and thousands, tens of thousands of
Oh, and remember the electronic fence that was going to stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail?
we had everything. We had, supersonic jets coming out the kazoo. Everything we had was beautiful and futuristic. The M16 rifle, for God's sake. I mean, it was like a space weapon. But the truth of the matter is, you would think that after a defeat like Vietnam, we'd get it through our heads. But part of the problem was that we live according, our vision of how the war will proceed flows from the myths of the last war. And the myths of the last war, when it came to 2001, were the myths that we created as a giant active theater in Desert Storm. And Desert Storm was the announcement that America would always be triumphant, would never be defeated, because look, we had smart bombs. We have all of these things that just go out and kill, and we dominate everything. And I would listen to Air Force presentations about how we can win war on our own. This is the mentality we went into that with, and we preserved it in when it came to the proxy war called Ukraine. We felt that there was no possible way something bad could happen to us, because NATO had 30 times the GDP of Russia. Russia was an economy no bigger than Italy, maybe just Spain and Portugal. I mean, it was unbelievable that we had reached a point where there was no possibility that we could lose, because we had the superior technology, the superior doctrine, air-land battle, and all of the rest, maneuver warfare, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea that anything bad could happen was unthinkable, and we kept denying that it could happen for 3 years while it was happening. And that is a judgment, I think, on us.
Do not oversell yourself to yourself. My statement. Do not undersell the enemy. One way we think of it is the North Koreans. When they attacked, they were brutal, but ultimately the Marines held them in the retreat from Chosun. However, then the Chinese were different. They went into battle with one man with a weapon and two behind him without, because they were going to pick it up when the man in front was murdered by American fire. We'd never seen such a thing. Didn't know what to make of it. The Marines thought the Chinese were insane. The Chinese were conducting a war that no one had ever imagined. And they kept thinking the Chinese were going to break. They came in waves. They turned on those quad 50s on them, and they didn't stop.
Right.
And I believe that that is the illustration that you're aiming at. We thought our weapons were superior, and the Marines would never break.
Well, what's shocking is NATO forces lost, I don't know what the exact total is for the U.S. contingents. The vast balance of forces there were American, was 37,000. So I guess all of NATO would be maybe 50,000 dead out of Korea. Well, the Chinese lost 500,000 dead, but they still defeated us for the first time since the campaign that led up to the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862. The U.S. had been defeated in a strategic campaign and defeated by a power that we had despised. And it's amazing, because this is essentially what we were doing in Ukraine. And the problem gets down to something more than just admonishing ourselves not to believe our own hype. What's more worrisome is what believing your own hype actually does to you and what it does for the enemy, because it creates a process of thinking that severely weakens your capacity to respond to things that the enemy might do that you aren't prepared for, or things the enemy might do that you've already disallowed because clearly the enemy is a lesser force than you and will never be able to do those things, a la the Chinese, overwhelming our lines in the middle of winter with guys who wore nothing more than cheap sneakers. I mean, this is a difficulty that I think goes to the same problem of American exceptionalism when it comes to battle. But imagine what this kind of mindset does for the enemy, because the enemy now can rely on your not being ready. You're not fully understanding what he is capable of, and therefore it's a gift. This we give a gift to the enemy, and we did this in Ukraine big time. We let the Russians build this huge fortified festoon, this thicket of anti-tank obstacles and bunkers, and thought that somehow because our weapons were so superior to theirs, they just break through. And yet that wasn't our own experience. The United States fought incredibly bitter battles trying to get through the German fortifications, Siegfried Line and others, battles like the Hürtgen Forest, which we did not win. Right. It was a total stalemate. I mean, this is something that is in our own experience, and yet we have discarded it.
And finally, there's so many examples of this. I wonder which one is your favorite. Never follow a strategic course of action that makes your enemy stronger. That's how we fight war, Germanicus. How Churchill said it. The Americans eventually do the right thing after trying everything else. That's us.
Right. The key here is never follow a strategic course of action that makes your enemy stronger. Well, in order for us not to do that, we have to understand the sources of the enemy's strength. And of course, by undervaluing the enemy and what the enemy can do, we essentially do not attack the thing that makes them strong. So clearly the thing that made the Chinese strong when they launched their great offensive across the Yalu was that they had morale, they had spirit, and they would do almost anything physically that they could to carry the battle to NATO and the well, it was called the UN actually, to the Allied forces. And we never understood that we could kill 10 times, 20, 30 times more Taliban than we lost as casualties, and they would still win. We couldn't get our arms around that, and because we couldn't do that, we weren't able to attack it. We never found a way to attack it, and so they ended up becoming stronger. And because we could not figure out a way to deal with how they fought war, we were more and more demoralized and weaker and beginning to look for the exit. And this is just unbelievable. I mean, this came really to the fore with Napoleon's invasion of Russia. And much of that has been replayed in Ukraine. And we haven't been able to get our mind around the idea that they have adapted and learned from the experience of the fighting so far in ways that have made them stronger and better. And we haven't figured out how to do that for ourselves. And so this is
just a moment to take before these 7 rules. We're about to interject ourselves into Venezuela. I don't know about Nigeria. It might be true that we're going to do that. Don't know. Too early. But in Venezuela, yes. We have the blessing and the encouragement of the opposition, Machado and Gonzalez, which is one mistake you identified. We're letting them define our goals. We're going in with insufficient ground forces and overwhelming air power. In other words, the strategy is going to be to bomb them into submission. That never has worked. I doubt if it ever will work. All you do is make the enemy stronger when you bomb them and don't wipe them out.
I think there is an unfortunate line that we can trace back to the Israeli, what's it, the not beepers, the little Motorola's that Hezbollah was using to communicate, and the way they were able to launch a kind of mass decapitation has, I think, inspired the U.S. to think that decapitation is an option. So it wouldn't just be bombing, it would be hitting all the leadership. And in a way, perversely, Israel's legitimated that as a tactic of war, even though this isn't a war. We would go and just wipe out all of the leadership in some, charmingly clever way, and then naturally things would fall apart. Whereas the reality is, we can't overthrow Venezuela as long as their army desires to resist us. And it's very unclear to me that we have the kind of leverage, the kind of inside influence that would allow us to be confident that were we to knock out the top network of their leadership, that the army would essentially go along with a regime change. And people say that was much more the case in the first Trump administration. And so I don't know where we would hope to discover, the secret to success here.
Don't you know that the Gerald Ford and Battle Group shows up and they're just going to fall on their knees and say yes? Don't you know that, Germanicus?
Yeah, we are overawed by our own weapons, and unfortunately,
that's one of the self-harms. We also think that they're not going to resist us because they're just a bunch of narco-terrorists. They're gangsters.
Well, I mean, I would look at the comparison to Panama. When we went into Panama, we went in with a lot more force, and Panama was a supportive semi-colony of the U.S., and we still had the Canal Zone, and we still had all of the levers that we could pull for it. What was and is a tiny country. So Venezuela is an enormous country by comparison, and its favelas and its jungles make it very unappealing place to fight.
The 7 lessons that the U.S. has managed to ignore for at least the 20th century. We're into the 21st, and we're waiting for another example from Germanicus. This is Londinium, 91 AD. It's all ahead of us, but we can see it. Now, Rome made these same mistakes often. As we changed emperors. After Marcus Aurelius and Varus, we changed emperors every 30 minutes for about a century. We made all these mistakes, so we recognize them. The one consistent mistake that the Romans avoided was forgiving the enemy. They never forgive the enemy. Never. The U.S. has a tendency to let bygones be bygones. We'll see when it comes to Venezuela. We'll see. We're going to turn to one more detail, which is Germanicus and I have opinions of Hollywood and Rome. And when we come back, Gladiator 2. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. He's Germanicus. The Centurions are all nodding. They enjoy us talking about Hollywood. It's 20 centuries away from them, but they enjoy it. And this is the Friends of History Debating Society. This is the Debating Society. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. Michael Vlahos is here, Germanicus, and the Centurions are enjoying our stories about making mistakes. They've seen all these mistakes in the field. They're 25-year men or more. They retired happily, successfully. A few marks on their bodies, but they're quite healthy people. And we've promised them a tale of Hollywood in the 21st century. Well, it took me some time to watch all of Gladiator 2. I would say about 6 months, because I couldn't bear it. I would make it go fast and go back and forget. I would turn the sound off. Well, I didn't quite finish it, because when we came to the ultimate scene of Hanno making a speech to the Praetorian army on one side and the worthwhile Roman army on the other side, I couldn't bear it. So I stopped. I'll watch all of it eventually, but I came close. And I thought it would be fun with Germanicus for us to speculate why it is that Hollywood can't get Rome right. Now, Gladiator 1 had a great star, a movie star, and that was its success. When you see a real movie star, it doesn't matter what costume he's in. You see it. You understand it. And the opening scene in Gladiator 1 is the movie. Why can't people know when they're beaten? That's the movie. On my order, let loose hell. That's the movie. And the fight in the German forest against the savages. That's the movie. But the rest of it has a romance. Fine. But when it came to number 2, they tried the bit about how his son was going to rise up and be just like him. And then they wrecked it, because the payoff was that all of these bad emperors and their counselors in the Senate, the villains, they were going to be removed, and we were going to go back to the Republic. Germanicus, it's so wrong, I don't even know where to start. Empires don't go back to republics. Republics are of no use once you're an empire. And the only thing I can think is that, because that's too much of a lesson for Hollywood script writing, given how tense they are. I mean, this is worked on script months and years, different drafts, different color paper. It was passed around between bankers and producers and directors and cameramen. I mean, they really work on this, but the payoff is the Republic. I'm thinking, what are they doing? There's no Republic in Rome after Augustus. That's the end of the Republic. It was aged out. The empire was necessary. And the only thing I can think, Germanicus, and I submit this to you, is Hollywood thinks the word republic means democracy. Is that possible, why they make this mistake?
It's a process, a kind of interplay between past and present that has always been there. Societies that in ancient times that look back on their forebears tended to want to make it a golden age, that from which they had fallen into some low estate, and that things were constantly in decline. The U.S., in contrast, is a republic of virtue, and the original vision of the American Republic was deeply informed by Rome and
Yes.
Greece, and especially to Greek and Roman ideas that fed into the Republic of virtue. And in effect, of course, Rome, with the very word res publica, and the Greeks with democracy, gave a kind of form, a kind of proscenium under which the drama of the Republic of Virtue could be enacted. And they knew them. They many of the founders and elites in America were conversant in Greek, and more than conversant in Latin. And yet, what they did effectively, even though they'd read these authors, they would also shape the past to fit their own needs and their own vision. And so when they approached Rome, therefore, Rome was a kind of morality play. It was something that, in a sense, inspired America, whose virtues were the foundation for America, and yet whose story was one of triumph and then tragedy, and ultimately of decline and a loss of virtue. And this is one of the reasons that that Gibbon wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire as a vast morality play,
Right.
with the villains being barbarism and religion, and therefore appealing to the ideals of the then, raging Enlightenment that had claimed the collective emotions of Europe, the European upper class at that time, and so he had to paint the Roman Empire in its later days as increasingly wrapped up in uh, debilitating religious rituals, stifling hierarchies and court intrigues, and beset always by the barbarity from without, the savages. And so in many ways, Gibbon helped to create our vision today of what we call the Byzantine Empire, which is completely wrong, that did not in any way understand the spirit of Rome or even the vision of Rome fully. Yet he'd read all the sources. He's magnificently sourced work, and yet the spirit of Rome to him had to be filtered through the spirit of his own age, and it had to be packaged as I said, a kind of morality play. And so today, I think we still do that, and so Rome has to be presented as being the imperial Rome is thoroughly corrupted, and when the Republican Rome is presented in whatever poor venue, it's always the loss of virtue of the Republic, and these men who were corrupted, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's not really what happened, as we know. Rome as a republic transformed into something very different from the original city-state built around a constitution for a city-state where people were connected to each other, and was effectively like an empire as early as the 3rd century BC. And so, and on the flip side, after Augustus created the Principate, the imperial institution still maintained the sensibility and consciousness of the Republic, as well as many of its institutions, and was far more responsive to not just elites, but also to the public opinion, and the idea of the sovereignty, legitimacy of Rome itself always being based on the Senate and the people of Rome. I mean, so it's always a distortion through the Western lens, and unfortunately, as you pointed out, the Western lens, when it is Hollywood, is a very simplistic one, with an inability to distinguish between, say, the Greek vision of democracy, the Roman ideal of the Republic, and then the fact that the empire was not that alien from the Republic it succeeded.
And simply put, the best thinking in Hollywood, which is consistent with the best thinking in media, and media is the best thinking we have, the conventional wisdom is that Republic is good, Empire is bad, and that there's no acceptance, none whatsoever, that Empire could ever be anything but bad. Is that where we are?
Yeah, and also Republic is good, but democracy is better. So there is this notion that somehow the original Republic of Virtue was flawed and needs to be constantly refreshed and made more progressive. And so you know, when Democrats, for example, talk about our democracy, they have a vision of a government that is that is a mirror of their progressive ideology, and they can't see that virtue in, say, Republicans who talk about the Republic, because they see the Republic as a kind of halfway house between old forms of monarchy and the vision they have of our democracy, which is a completely amorphous notion that changes almost daily with shifts in political fashion.
So I should presume that they didn't do this thinking that they were being aspirational. They did this because that's their opinion. It's not, it's fixed. It's not in debate. Republic good, empire bad.
Yeah, and they confuse the imperial office of Rome with the dictatorship of a mafia don or some banana republic.
Right. All right. Yeah, I'm not. We're. I didn't make the world. Neither did you. We're just sitting here in Londinium, admiring the Americans and their aspirations. Let's put it that way. They see the world as they want it to be. They don't see the world as it is. We have the advantage of seeing the world as it is. Most of it. Most of it.
Every society is guilty of that. But we can at least offer useful clarification to the 21st century audience.
We're going to see Seneca tonight. Last week we saw the opening act of a play in which the spurned wife takes revenge on her husband and the new wife and the children, and then eventually the town, the city-state, the empire. It's quite a revenge cycle. That was just the first act. I don't know whether they're going to show us the second act this week. It gets chilly in the theater, and the fires aren't warm enough for my senior legs. So we'll stay as long as we can and give you a report. But what's wonderful about Seneca when you watch his plays is you ask yourself always, does he know that Nero's going to murder him? You think to yourself, there must be something to it, because he's so consistent about revenge. It's an odd way to anticipate your own death and writing plays in which you get back to him, get back at him. Nero commits suicide. He's never murdered. So I don't know if that was Seneca's thinking or whether Seneca is going to influence that. I don't know. Nero's suicide, caveat. We're told everything we know about it by his slave, whom he forces to help him commit suicide. So there might be something to the fact that the slave was a little more eager than we think. But Seneca's play has self-destruction in it, and we'll enjoy it tonight. This is the Friends of History Debating Society in Londinium on a chilly evening by the Thames with our friends the Centurions. Michael Vlahos is Gaius, is Germanicus. John Batchelor is Gaius, and thank you for listening. Good night.